Welcome to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. As always, if you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share this podcast with them. In the summer of 1071, on the plains of eastern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, a single battle set off a chain reaction that would change the world. It marked the moment when the balance of power shifted between East and West, when the ancient Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, began its long, irreversible decline. The consequences of this battle would echo far beyond the immediate loss of land or soldiers. It cleared the way for a new force to rise, the Turks, who would dominate Anatolia and eventually the Middle East and southeastern Europe for centuries to come. The results of this single encounter set the stage for the Crusades, a clash of civilizations that shaped both Europe and the Islamic world. It laid the groundwork for the rise of the Ottoman Empire, a power that would challenge European kingdoms, conquer Constantinople, and rule vast territories until the early 20th century. The lines drawn in the sands of Manzikert changed trade routes, borders, faith, and empires, and those changes are still with us today. It's fascinating to realize how a medieval battle could still influence the modern world, how decisions made on a distant field nearly 1,000 years ago still shape where power lies and who controls the land and its resources. Let's now experience the Battle of Manzikert.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 80, The Battle of Manzikert, 1071, Current Era. Byzantine forces, roughly 40,000 men. Turkish forces, roughly 40,000 men. The defeat at Manzikert broke the spine of Byzantine military power. Anatolia, the empire's great reservoir of soldiers, the rugged peasants who had once filled its ranks with unshakable resolve, was lost. From that moment on, the Seljuk Turks ruled Anatolia. The empire's heartland, the source of its warriors, its grain, and its lifeblood, was now under the crescent banner. The empire shrank, a shadow of its former self. Byzantium clung to the lands immediately surrounding Constantinople, an isolated citadel standing alone against a world that had moved on. Never again would the Byzantine Empire command the fear and respect of its enemies. Its armies, once the envy of the world, became mercenary-driven and hollow. The Byzantines would linger on, but as a diminished power, unable to recapture the military glory that had once defined them.
By the mid-11th century, the Byzantine Empire, scarred, battered, and long past its golden age, still stood as a power that few dared to provoke. Its reputation alone could make weaker states hesitate, but its foundation was beginning to crack. A parade of inept emperors and empresses, each as fleeting as the last, squandered the empire's fortunes while its frontiers lay neglected, defenseless against those who would tear away the imperial lands piece by piece. The Byzantine army, still built upon the rock-solid doctrines of centuries past, retained its place as the most disciplined and organized military machine of its time. But an army without proper leadership is like a blade left to rust, and worse still, the men holding that blade were no longer the hardy Anatolian peasants of old. The time-tested Strategicon and Tactica, military treatises forged in earlier ages, still provided the framework for Byzantine warfare. But the empire's lifeblood, the rugged Anatolian farmer warriors who once formed the army's backbone, had vanished from its ranks. The army had become a mosaic of foreign recruits and mercenaries, many of them skilled killers, the famed Varangian Guard foremost among those. But their loyalty lay with gold, not with Byzantium. Coins kept their swords sharp, coins alone. The Byzantine army stood atop the world's military hierarchy, not by strength alone, but because no organized foe had yet emerged to challenge it. That illusion of supremacy masked a bitter truth. The army's foundation was brittle, and poor leadership would shatter it beyond repair. For 2 centuries, the Byzantine Empire had been locked in a relentless struggle along its southeastern borders, bathed by the unstoppable tide of Islam. Land after land had been stripped away, yet the empire still clung to Asia Minor and the southern Balkans. The Byzantine army knew no rest. When the Muslim advance ebbed, their swords turned westward to confront the ceaseless turmoil of Europe. Serbs, Magyars, Pechenegs, Cumans, Tribes and peoples whose migrations shook the empire's European borders like an earthquake that would not end. Yet none of those foes, scattered, disorganized, and divided, possessed the strength to do more than gnaw at Byzantium's flanks, weakening it one bloody bite at a time. The empire's diplomats wielded silver as deftly as their soldiers wielded steel. Bribery bought alliances, promises of peace, tamed unruly tribes, and the distant glint of Byzantine swords kept enemies quiet just long enough for the empire to focus its might against the looming menace of Islam. At the empire's eastern frontier, Armenia stood as both a shield and a crossroads. Its rugged hills a barrier, its wealth a temptation. Armenia brimmed with natural treasures, and its position gave it access to the arteries of trade flowing from Asia and Egypt, a prize coveted by conquerors for generations. Its people were as tough as their mountains, fiercely independent and never eager to bow to foreign overlords. For centuries, Armenia had been stalked by raiders and conquerors alike, drawn by its riches and strategic value. Now it stood in the crosshairs of a new threat, the Seljuk Turks. They rode out of the steppes of Central Asia like a storm, yet this was no passing thundercloud. This was a force ready to stay. The Seljuks were no ordinary horsemen. They had adopted Sunni Islam and discarded the habits of nomadic plunder. Where they conquered, they built governments and claimed the land as their own. By 1040, the Seljuks dominated Persia and held Baghdad in their iron grip, reshaping the Islamic world as they went. This rising power clashed with the Egyptian Fatimids, a rival dynasty that clung to Shia Islam and ruled over the Levant and western Arabian coast. Their rivalry promised war for wealth, for power, and for their god. Syria's trade routes were the prize that made the rivalry inevitable. Wealth, ambition, and faith drew the Seljuks and the Fatimids into a collision that would shake the Middle East to its core. The Fatimids, wary of Seljuk power, found an ally in Constantinople. This pact meant that wherever the Seljuks and Fatimids clashed, the Byzantine Empire was now invested and ready to take its share of the spoils. Byzantium's hunger for Armenia's wealth and strategic position was unrelenting, but that ambition put Romanus and his forces squarely on a collision course with Seljuk expansion. In 1065, Alp Arslan took command of the Seljuk Turks, a man whose name meant heroic lion and whose actions would soon justify that title. A rare blend of cunning statesman and brilliant general, Arslan brought stability and purpose to the Seljuk people. Under his rule, they thrived and they expanded, their borders reaching further and further west. Arslan followed Tughril Bey, the conqueror who had already secured Baghdad, Mosul, and Diyarbakir, placing these cities beneath the Seljuk crescent. Determined to expand his empire, Alp Arslan led his warriors against Georgia and turned his sights on Ani, Armenia's proud and ancient capital, a city brimming with treasures but poorly defended against his might. In 1064, Ani fell. The walls were breached, the gates shattered, and the city was left a smoldering ruin under Seljuk control, a grim prelude to Alp Arslan's greater ambitions for Anatolia. Arslan knew that conquest was not enough. He sought to transform the land itself, stripping Anatolia of its cultivated fields to create vast stretches of open grazing, perfect for the horses that carried his armies to victory. These ambitions put Alp Arslan directly in the sights of the Byzantines. In 1068, Romanus IV Diogenes ascended to the imperial throne, a soldier emperor, eager to restore the strength of a crumbling empire. Romanus was no stranger to war. His campaigns in the Balkans had earned him some acclaim, but the army viewed him with suspicion. The elite Varangian Guard, always watchful, distrusted his favoritism toward native-born troops, seeing it as an insult to their loyalty and their worth. Romanus looked east to Armenia, determined to drive back the Seljuks and reclaim Byzantine dominance. Wasting no time, Romanus gathered his forces, assembling the best of Byzantium's fractured army, and struck at the Seljuks. They had just looted the west-central province of Phrygia, and Romanus meant to make them pay for their audacity. At Sebastia, modern-day Sivas, Romanus struck with speed and with precision, catching the Seljuks off guard. The Byzantine forces scattered their enemies, reclaimed their stolen treasures, and freed every prisoner the Turks had dragged away. Emboldened by this success, Romanus pushed south toward Aleppo, striking deep into enemy territory. His army plundered the outskirts before marching back to Anatolia through Alexandretta, banners high and their morale soaring. In 1069, Romanus renewed his offensive, driving the Seljuks from the western province of Cappadocia, but war's fickle. At Kalat, near the dark waters of Lake Van, Romanus tasted defeat and was forced to withdraw. Though undeterred, Romanus clashed with Alp Arslan again months later near Heraclea. This time, the emperor triumphed. But the Seljuk leader proved as elusive as he was dangerous, breaking free from a Byzantine trap and retreating to Aleppo. Trouble brewed in the west as well. In 1070, Romanus turned his attention to the Normans and left his eastern armies in the hands of his nephew, Manuel Comnenus, a capable man but untested against the Seljuk tide. Manuel's campaign ended in disaster. He was defeated and captured by Arisigi, Alp Arslan's brother-in-law, but captivity breeds intrigue. Together, the prisoner and captor whispered plans of rebellion against Arslan himself. Manuel persuaded Arisiagi to travel to Constantinople and negotiate with Romanus. Their meeting ended in an unlikely alliance, one that Romanus hoped would fracture Seljuk unity. But Alp Arslan's wrath would not be denied. When Constantinople refused to hand over Arisiagi, the Sultan marched his armies to war once more, the shadow of battle stretching back to Armenia. Alp Arslan wasted no time. He marched his army north of Lake Van, closing on the fortress city of Manzikert. The siege was swift and brutal. The city fell into Seljuk hands, its gates smashed open, and its defenses crumbled. From there he moved toward Edessa, testing its defenses, but the city resisted him. Rather than squander men and time, Arslan turned his army back toward Persia, content to bide his time for a greater confrontation. Romanus IV Diogenes, the emperor warrior, was not content to let this challenge stand. He rallied his armies and set out in pursuit of his rival. Early in the year 1071, Romanus summoned his forces from across the empire. How many men he gathered, nobody really knows. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers speak of 200,000 or even 400,000 Byzantine soldiers, numbers so absurdly inflated they belong in the realm of myth, not reality. In truth, Romanus commanded a formidable host, larger perhaps than Alp Arslan's army, at least in the early stages. It was, quote, considerable, end quote, as the historian J.F.C. Fuller notes, though numbers alone would not win this war. The real flaw in Romanus's army was not its size, but its spirit. Loyalty was tenuous, discipline brittle, fatal weaknesses for any army on the march. Romanus struggled to command respect. German mercenaries grumbled and resisted his authority, and across the ranks, soldiers disobeyed his orders and looted the countryside, turning Romanus's campaign into chaos before battle was even joined. But treachery was the true blade poised at Romanus's back. His wife, Empress Eudocia, and her son, Michael VII, conspired in secret against him, setting events in motion that would cripple the empire's fortunes. Among his generals marched traitors, men loyal not to Romanus, but to Eudocia's scheming court. Their betrayal would seal the emperor's fate on the battlefield. Romanus halted at Theodosiopolis, modern-day Erzurum, to finalize his campaign strategy. Every moment, every supply line, every contingency was measured. Confident that Alp Arslan was still far away in Persia, Romanus planned a daring advance. He would reclaim Manzikert and strike south to Kalat, establishing a base of operations for a bold campaign deep into Seljuk territory. Romanus led the main Byzantine column toward Manzikert, while the assault on Kalat was entrusted to Frankish mercenaries under Roussel de Bailul, a man as capable as he was unpredictable. The plan on paper was sound. The garrisons in both cities were weak and victory seemed assured. What Romanus did not know, what no Byzantine scout had discovered, was that Alp Arslan was not in Persia. He was in Syria, preparing to strike against the Fatimids, his army already on the move. The news of Romanus' advance reached Arslan, and without hesitation, the Sultan gathered every man within reach and marched swiftly to Mosul, preparing to confront the Byzantines head-on. In Mosul, 14,000 reinforcements swelled his ranks. From there, he marched northeast to Koy, where fresh warriors arrived from Azerbaijan to join the Seljuk host. With the force now numbering around 40,000 strong, Arslan turned his army west. He skirted the southern shore of Lake Van, a silent advance toward Kalat, ready to strike before Romanus knew what was coming. At Manzikert, Romanus achieved his first victory, seizing the fortress without much resistance. But then he made a fatal mistake. He divided his forces. Reinforcements went to Balil at Kalat, and another 12,000 men were dispatched on a foraging mission to Georgia. How many men Rusul de Balil had under his command is lost to history, but what is certain is that when Alp Arslan's forces appeared on August the 16th, seemingly from thin air, Balil turned and fled. Worse still, Balul's retreat was not toward Romanus. He marched northwest, away from both armies, abandoning the Byzantine emperor to his fate. It was treachery, plain and simple. The hand of Empress Eudocia's conspiracy reached even here. For Balul's withdrawal defied all logic. He sent no word to Romanus, leaving the emperor blind to the true scale of the Seljuk threat. With Kalat quickly subdued, Arslan wasted no time. His army surged forward, their destination clear: Manzikert, where Romanus was about to face the fight of his life. Romanus, unaware of the Seljuk advance, marched his army to Kalat. He believed the region lay clear and open before him, but the enemy had already coiled itself in his path, ready to strike. The illusion of safety was shattered when Romanus' advance guard collided with the full strength of Arslan's Seljuk army. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Romanus sent urgent orders to Balul to reinforce him, but it was a message sent to no one. Despite the setbacks, Romanus' confidence did not waver. He was a soldier, after all, a man who believed in the strength of Byzantine steel and the weight of his heavy cavalry. Romanus placed his faith in the tactics that had won Byzantium 1,000 victories. The heavy infantry and cavalry of the empire, clad in steel and honed by centuries of war, would meet and crush the lightly armored, swift-moving Seljuk horsemen. Arslan sent word offering terms of peace, but Romanus, defiant and determined, scoffed at the offer. He demanded total submission, a promise that the Turks would never again set foot on Byzantine soil. With neither leader willing to yield, the stage was now set. Both armies bristled for battle, the air heavy with the knowledge that one empire would stumble and the other would rise. The Byzantine plan was as old as the empire itself. Maintain tight, disciplined ranks with heavy infantry and cavalry, force the enemy into terrain where their speed would mean nothing, and grind them into dust. But Arslan knew his own craft well. From the opening moments of the battle, Seljuk horse archers loosed clouds of arrows, a hailstorm of death that targeted the Byzantine horses. The mercenaries, Kipchaks and Pechenegs, watched the carnage unfold and, fearing for their lives, broke and fled the field. Watching his cavalry weaken under the unrelenting Seljuk archery, Romanus made his move. He ordered his lines forward, a calculated advance meant to sweep the enemy from the battlefield. The maneuver worked. The Byzantine line pushed forward like a wall of iron, and the Seljuks retreated, falling back past their camp. Romanus pressed them harder, sensing victory in his grasp. But the Seljuks had one weapon Romanus could not counter: the open plains. They withdrew with precision, drawing the Byzantines further and further into their trap. The day slipped away as the pursuit dragged on, and victory remained elusive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Romanus faced a cruel dilemma. To push on was pointless, but retreating to camp would expose his army's flanks. Pushing forward would win him nothing, yet it was too late to withdraw safely. His army, tired and stretched thin, was vulnerable. With no other choice, Romanus ordered his men to fall back. Arslan was ready. The Seljuk cavalry wheeled and struck, harrying the retreating Byzantine ranks. Seeing the chaos, Romanus shouted for his men to turn and to fight, to face the Seljuk charge. But only the forward ranks obeyed. The rear lines continued to fall back, the unity of the army unraveling before his eyes. The retreat of the rear line was no accident. Whether out of confusion or deliberate betrayal, they abandoned the field, leaving Romanus and his loyal soldiers stranded. That line was under the command of Andronicus Ducas, son of Romanus' sworn enemy. The betrayal was now plain. Andronicus made straight for the Byzantine camp, his men at his back, leaving Romanus stranded on the battlefield with a fraction of his force. A doomed emperor surrounded on all sides. The Seljuks, seizing their chance, surged forward. They surrounded the remaining Byzantines, closing in like a tightening noose. The final stand was swift, and it was merciless. Romanus' men fought with the desperate courage of doomed men, but there was no escape. By the time the darkness swallowed the battlefield, the Seljuks stood victorious. Romanus was among the few left alive, bloodied and broken. The emperor was dragged before Arslan. Arslan, as magnanimous in victory as he was ruthless in battle, treated his captive emperor with unexpected respect. A treaty was struck. Romanus would return to Constantinople to raise an enormous ransom, paid in installments over 50 years. The ransom, like the empire Romanus left behind, would never be fulfilled. While Romanus sat in Seljuk captivity, his throne was seized. Caesar John Ducas, the architect of Andronicus's betrayal, claimed the imperial crown, a triumph of treachery that proved as damning to Byzantium as the battle itself. Eudocia, the empress whose schemes had helped destroy her husband, found treachery a double-edged sword. Now stripped of power, she was cast into a nunnery, while John Ducas ruled as regent for her son, Michael VII, a puppet on an unstable throne. Romanus, though scarred and humiliated, would not accept defeat. Upon his return, he rallied loyal troops and challenged the usurper. At Docia, however, fate struck him down again. Defeat this time was final, his cause and army shattered. Andronicus, the son of his bitterest foe, seized Romanus and delivered his punishment. The emperor was blinded, not with surgical precision, but with such savagery that the wounds festered, and in agony, Romanus Diogenes, soldier and emperor, soon succumbed to death. Yet even in the shadow of his own ruin, Romanus had sent the first payment of his ransom to Arslan, a gesture that spoke not of defeat, but of a man who, to the last, honored his word. Edward Gibbon described the defeat at Manzikert with his usual piercing clarity, quote, "The Byzantine writers deplored the loss of an inestimable pearl. They forgot to mention that in this fatal day, the Asiatic provinces of Rome were irretrievably sacrificed," end quote. What Byzantium lost was not just a battle, but the heart of its empire. From the ashes of Manzikert rose the Turks, the new masters of Asia Minor and much of the Middle East. Byzantine rule in the region was shattered, its fragments scattered and irretrievable. Though the Seljuks themselves would eventually yield to the Ottomans, their victory at Manzikert and the scorched earth devastation they unleashed reshaped Anatolia forever, leaving a void where Byzantine power had once stood unchallenged. Arslan, victorious but restless, pushed his forces back into the field in 1072, but fate, ever cruel, struck the Sultan down. He was assassinated, and his son Malik Shah assumed his place, ready to carry his father's empire to even greater heights. Malik Shah finished the grim work his father had started. Cities were razed, towns were emptied, and farmlands were laid to waste. Those who survived the sword were dragged away into slavery, leaving Anatolia desolate. The Seljuk onslaught consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. Byzantine citizens were slaughtered or sold as chattel. The fertile lands of Asia Minor became a wasteland, a land abandoned by hope for generations. The Turks turned Anatolia into what the steppe horsemen had always sought: vast, empty grassland that stretched to the horizon, perfect for the grazing of their mounts and the breeding of future conquerors. Anatolia's physical landscape, once dotted with thriving cities and villages, was never the same. Politically, the Byzantine Empire staggered but did not fall. Yet it was a hollow victory, for half its territories were gone, torn away as easily as flesh from bone. The peasants of Anatolia, the unyielding backbone of the Byzantine army, were gone. Never again would they march to defend the empire. Byzantium, which had already begun leaning on foreign mercenaries, now fell fully into dependence. The empire's armies were no longer its own. As with Rome in its dying days, the true power now lay with whoever controlled the military, not with the imperial vision or governance. The Byzantine throne had become a battleground in itself. An emperor's defeat meant he had lost the favor of God, and with it, his right to rule. Legitimacy was no longer a matter of birth, but of brute force. Might made right, and the result was chaos. A revolving door of emperors who wore the crown for months or years before losing it to someone stronger. Lacking stability in government, Byzantium's strength drained away. The Normans seized lands in the Mediterranean, tightening the noose that would one day choke the empire to death. Weakened and distracted, the empire stood defenseless as nomadic tribes harried its European holdings, gnawing away at Byzantium's flailing grasp on its frontier. Less than 25 years after the disaster at Manzikert, Constantinople was on its knees, begging the West for help. The West answered, and the First Crusade was born. A holy war sparked not just by faith, but by the Byzantine Empire's desperate plea for survival.